Thank you for joining our webinar today, part 2 of our Shifting QA Left series. Today's session will focus on getting everyone on the same page with behavior-driven development. I hope everyone's having a great afternoon. My name is Mason Chaudhry. I am the Principal of Enterprise Operations at Excion Solutions, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over just a couple of housekeeping items. First, we welcome and encourage your questions throughout the webinar. To ask a question, all you need to do is type your question directly into the question window on your GoToWebinar control panel and submit. We'll answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session after today's presentation. Secondly, we are recording today's webinar and we'll post it on the Excion website later this week. I'll send you an email once it's live in case you want to watch it again or forward it to any of your colleagues. So with that, we'll go ahead and begin. As more and more organizations within various industries utilize agile practices for development to expedite SDLC processes, to improve quality, to lower costs, a rising question that's coming up for business and IT leaders, managers, technologists is, are we satisfied with our agile adoption, or are we looking to have an agile transformation? Have we achieved the type of maturity that gives us the most ROI by going down the agile path? The difference between adoption and transformation arises from an organization's ability to look beyond the world of Scrum, SAFe, Kanban, and at the possibility of achieving even greater quality, speed, and collaboration through techniques that are relatively new and offer great promise in the development arena. Be it healthcare, finance, or other industries, the future of Agile is now with concepts such as behavior-driven development and test-driven development. So with that said, let's take a deeper dive. So please join me in welcoming our speaker today and QA expert, Rajat Sud. Rajat is a solution architect focused on Agile delivery and DevOps adoption. He has been supporting one of our largest payer clients of healthcare benefits for federal employees. He is responsible for evangelical I haven't had my coffee yet, evangelizing modern tools and processes, supporting various QA disciplines, and modernizing their test automation infrastructure from closed source systems such as HP suite of products to more extensible offerings such as Selenium, JMeter, and various web services testing tools. Rajat routinely engages in various DevOps and Agile forums, offering and seeking new ideas to streamline development and deployment pipelines. In his previous roles, he's consulted with various tech firms spanning media, finance, and even wine e-commerce, my favorite industry. So now I'd like to turn it over to Rajat.
Thanks very much, Mason. In this part 2 of the Shift QA Left series, I am excited to introduce behavior-driven development. We'll kick things off with a very quick recap from our earlier session with the intent to introduce BDD. We'll talk about the origins of BDD from TDD, as you mentioned. We'll do a deep dive into how best to use it in each of your organizations, along with a technical demonstration. We'll also exchange some of the virtues of BDD for every stakeholder and some gotchas to be wary about. Finally, we'll round up with some takeaways and hopefully some questions from each of you attending the webinar. Now, in our earlier webinar, we spoke about how now, more than ever, our industry is providing us an opportunity to transform QA as a bottleneck to QA as an enabler, to give developers the confidence to refactor and product owners the confidence in test coverage, while the team delivers on a faster time to market. We spoke extensively about implementing technologies and processes for rapid development and low maintenance via in-sprint automation, and most importantly, bringing people along for the ride by empowering them to adopt and contribute. And to round up the last session, we're big proponents of collaborating beyond the confines of just QA, and this can be realized by implementing scalable technologies and proving, measuring, and increasing ROI, one automated execution at a time. Through paradigms such as TDD and BDD, our aim is to rope in all stakeholders ensuring that quality is built throughout the SDLC and not just as a post-development activity anymore. We shared some staggering ROI metrics to the tune of 1,200% and growing. Now, while this ROI is impressive, it shouldn't be too big a surprise given the virtues of test automation. But the speed at which this ROI can be achieved while fostering a new level of collaboration is something we will talk about during this webinar. So kicking things off with a history lesson about the origins of BDD. BDD started off by employing the concept behind test-driven development, which in turn advocated to write unit tests even before a single piece of application code was written. Now, naturally, upon initial execution, you'd expect all of them to fail, because there is nothing to test. But as you flesh out the application code, your tests will begin to pass. And theoretically, when all your tests have passed, you should have yourself a working system. One of TDD's criticisms was that it only included developers, since unit tests are typically their forte. So BDD originated with the intent to foster the basic principles of TDD, but this time to include all stakeholders, not just developers. What it evangelizes is to work from the outside in. And this is no different from how we typically conceive agile acceptance criteria, by asking ourselves, what will it take for me to accept the system? Then how's this different, you may ask? More on that in the next few slides. BDD better implements the ideals of agile by producing streamlined documentation that can be better interpreted by developers to code and can be translated into test cases and automated scripts by testers. Now, most organizations have heavily invested in agile, so don't worry, BDD doesn't replace agile, but actually it supplements it. In fact, a few industry practitioners have gone as far as stating that BDD is Agile 2.0, a better way of doing Agile. And it does this by aiding the decomposition of stories into verifiable, unambiguous acceptance criteria. To elaborate further, as with most Agile artifacts, you start with conceiving a product. The product decomposes into several high-level epics. Each epic may further decompose into user stories, and then subsequently during Agile grooming sessions, the user stories are fleshed out into one or more acceptance criteria, which once again typically beg to ask the question, what will it take for me to accept the story? Now we're going to introduce some BDD-specific jargon here. What BDD advocates is that this acceptance criteria be documented in the form of scenarios, supplemented by examples. Think of this as capturing how your system or product will behave. For now, just hold on to this thought and these terms as we proceed further. And to put things in context, the only add-on, if you want to call it that BDD imposes is a format of documentation that lends itself to a solution-based, customer-centric, example-driven thought process, demonstrating the operation of the proposed system with the intent to resolve ambiguity early. Now that we've provided an introduction, let's dive into it with a concrete example. Remember, we just spoke about documenting acceptance criteria in the form of scenarios. Now, scenarios are documented as quote-unquote behaviors. A behavior, quite simply put, is a combination of three things: a context, followed by an action, followed by the outcome of that action. And these behaviors are documented in a very English-like language referred to as gherkin, like the cucumber. where offer behavior, the context is prefixed by the word given, the action by the word when, and the outcome by then. Let's share an example that will make this usage clearer. In this example on your screen, we're documenting the steps which likely you had taken to register for this webinar. So starting with a user story, which is akin to a quote-unquote feature, we've documented the user story as a Excion customer, I'd like to register for a webinar so I can learn the virtues of shifting QA left. The context for registering for this webinar is that you are on Excion's website. The action is that you complete and submit the registration form. The outcome is that you see a message indicating a successful registration. So formatting this into Gherkin, remember that language we spoke about? Here's what we land up with. Given I am on www.excion.com and I navigate to the webinar registration form, when I enter the registration details and I click the submit button, then the successful registration message is displayed. You will notice the use of an additional keyword, quote unquote, and in this specific behavior, in addition to the given, when, and then. And this keyword can be used to supplement the context, action, or outcome when more of each have to be captured. And finally, hopefully one thing is clear. What we've just constructed is very English-like, and anyone can write it. It's unambiguous and verifiable, which means that you're clearly defining a context. Think of it as a precondition for the behavior, followed by the actions, followed by the outcome of that action. And these three elements collectively define the behavior. And when you've implemented a set of behaviors, you've got yourself a working, tested system. And documenting acceptance criteria in the form of behaviors, just like we've demonstrated, helps foster the use of consistent terminology across the board, starting with requirements, and then coding and testing against them. Further, this format also facilitates interaction between stakeholders, ensuring that every system behavior is understood completely from the context in which it occurs to the actions performed to facilitate it, and finally, the expected outcome. In this session, we're going to introduce one of the benefits of BDD through the guise of test automation. Here are some BDD-specific terms as they relate to test automation. User stories are called features, while acceptance criteria become scenarios. Just like a user story has one or more acceptance criteria, a feature can have one or more scenarios. So just getting out of this presentation mode and into a quick technical demonstration. You should see momentarily on my screen, we're in the development environment. And what you should see is what is referred to as a feature file. Now this will look pretty familiar based on the earlier slide that we've shared, which is essentially the behavior that we've captured to register for the webinar. And the first constituent in this BDD test automation framework is referred to, once again, as a feature file. The next step is to actually create a step definition. Now this is where the underlying code for each of the steps defined in the behavior are contained. For each line of the scenario, we've implemented executable code. In this example, since we're attempting to demonstrate and test a behavior encountered on a web browser, we've utilized the Selenium WebDriver Java API to automate browser actions, and JUnit to implement some assertions for validation. So once again, if you actually F3 into any of these steps from the feature file, you can actually get a glimpse of the underlying code that it corresponds to. Onto the third component of this BDD test automation framework. Once the feature file and step definitions are implemented, the last component is called a quote-unquote runner. The runner essentially tells the runtime engine the location of the feature files by this path right here, and the accompanying step definitions. That's represented by the package defined right here. And think of this runner as the glue that holds both these artifacts together, the features as well as the step definitions. These artifacts, all three of them, are implemented using a popular Java API called Cucumber, which supports behavior-driven development. To execute this test, we simply run the feature, and in a few seconds, you should see the browser appear and demonstrate and test the behavior of registering for the webinar. So we are running this in our Mozilla Firefox version. And momentarily, you should see the Xion website appear, which is the step one of our behavior, followed by a click to the webinar registration form, followed by the filling in of the information, and then a validation of the confirmation message. And as the results get captured, you should soon see the outcome of this execution that we performed as the JUnit test. Now our website is up and registration was successful, and you can see all the steps that we've actually implemented are reported as being successfully executed and passed. So coming back into our presentation, we wanted to just summarize the three artifacts that we just saw. We saw a feature file that documents the application behavior being tested and automated, and this was the file that actually implemented the very English-like Gherkin syntax. Hopefully, you also noticed how readable it was and can be written by anyone. We then introduced the step definition class, because we've implemented it in Java, that contained the underlying code for each step of the feature file's behavior. And finally, the runner, which is the glue holding the feature file and the step definitions together, along with some reporting hooks. So now that we've explained what BDD is and demonstrated one of its benefits related to test automation, let's talk about building a practice such that all team members are empowered towards contributing towards it. Starting at the source, your downstream artifacts will only be as good as the source documentation, which means that effective elicitation techniques should be practiced and content from all stakeholders should be solicited. BDD recommends the use of the 3 amigo participation technique, for which grooming sessions should be attended at the very least by product folks, by developers, and by testers, so that all vital interests are adequately represented. During these sessions, example mapping articulates an innovative way to capture scenarios, also known as acceptance criteria, related to every story. I have included a link to an introduction to this technique. Now, because of the practical orientation of these webinars, we also wanted to share experiences from our clients. Once stories were scoped in the planning sessions, the business analysts at our client site took a first pass at documenting the acceptance criteria in the Gherkin format. In the grooming sessions, typically facilitated by product owners or business analysts, the entire team would provide feedback and hopefully contribute additional scenarios from their perspectives. So for example, developers can communicate technical complexity and challenges. Testers can augment with additional scenarios related to testing happy path, positive, negative, and edge scenarios. One important consideration that the team implemented to better accommodate complexity was that if a specific story decomposed into more than 4 scenarios, the story was split. And once the team agreed and committed to the user stories and their scenarios, developers estimated and implemented the criteria, while testers translated the Gherkin into automated tests, like we demonstrated earlier, simultaneously, achieving a degree of test-driven development that we spoke about earlier. So moving on through our agenda, let's talk about how all the various stakeholders can benefit from behavior-driven development. I adapted some of the content that follows from one of BDD's founders, Dan North's presentation, starting with product owners and business analysts. Now, many a times, product owners naturally tend to favor the business side of things constantly, and rightly so, pushing the scope envelope, devising new features in consultation with the business. Decomposing any feature or user story into usage scenarios can help them better understand the true technical or testing complexity of what they're requesting, enabling them to better align their expectations with the rest of the team. Further, the elicitation and documentation process can be structured by following consistent practices. It can also provide a greater degree of transparency of the team's activities. Think of the conceived scenarios as a checklist of behaviors that the team members can pick up and implement and test. And in doing so, the team can better manage themselves and ship the product faster. As a developer, working through behaviors helps you focus. By having most, if not all, anticipated outcomes supplemented by the context and actions which cause them to allow you to implement all known conditions beforehand, as opposed to waiting for issues to surface post-deployment. By implementing a robust test-driven design augmented by automated tests, as we've demonstrated, your code will be subject to tests as soon as it is deployed and upon successive deployments, giving you the confidence to refactor, knowing that if you break anything, it will be caught. Finally, and arguably the most important, just like product folks better understand the technical complexity, developers are also in a position to better understand the business by capturing scenarios on both fronts, the business and the technology. Moving on, as a tester, the big benefit of BDD is that you have a streamlined and structured path to writing automated test scripts, possibly within the sprint itself. Remember our TDD talk about writing tests before code? And because hopefully you are automating all the repetitive tests that provide substantial regression coverage, you have free time to do more creative, interesting exploratory tests, mimicking better the user experience, or possibly even pushing the application behavior beyond normal usage conditions. And one of the biggest benefits in my mind is the reduced documentation burden. Because scenarios can be refactored as automated scripts, you no longer have to rehash specs into test cases and then automate them. Moreover, with feature files, you've got self-documented code where the underlying code in step definitions map to every line of a scenario, providing insight into what it actually is doing or testing. As a project manager, because all your stakeholders are unifying to derive a spec, which are behaviors in our case, developers are coding to it, testers are testing against it, you've got this inherent traceability. Every line of requirement is potentially being accompanied with test scripts. And because the team is collaborating on documenting the spec, all stakeholders are on the same page at every step of the SDLC. So if they're not apparent already, let's talk about some of the advantages and gotchas of BDD. Here is a slide summing up the advantages of BDD. As you can imagine, this is going to be a loaded slide. By means of effective elicitation techniques, including a cross-section of all stakeholders, Agile user stories can be decomposed with an eye to better communicating business intent and technical complexity. Using this, developers can better estimate and design code, while testers can understand and devise additional scenarios exercising all aspects of that behavior. By having test artifacts produced in concurrence with documenting system behavior, an inherent traceability is achieved, enabling greater transparency in what's being tested and what gaps may exist. The use of a simple, structured, uniform syntax fosters understanding among all stakeholders, including business and technical folks, leaving less room for ambiguity. Finally, what this all culminates into is an executable specification. BDD pundits refer to it as living documentation, where the state of any implemented behavior is testable in an automated manner. Any failure can be attributed to change in system behavior, which can merit either an update to the behavior or, if required, it can be tagged as obsolete in case the behavior is deprecated. Now, as with any new paradigm, here are some gotchas in our experience. Firstly, from our clients, we've experienced an increased level of upfront collaboration. And while this isn't necessarily a bad thing, what this does translate into is longer grooming sessions. Now, my counter argument to that is the more upfront time spent in resolving ambiguities, the less time is spent in editing code to accommodate them later in the form of defects or change orders. Next up, of course, like with all people-related things, there is a bit of a learning curve and an adjustment to the way things are accomplished. So migrating from that bullet-based acceptance criteria to adding and enriching each of those with a context and an action and an outcome can be typically a little new to most stakeholders. But given the general newness of Agile paradigms, and with BDD even newer, I do strongly believe that the benefits of BDD are far too great to ignore. So to round up our conversation today, here are some takeaways. BDD can be implemented quite easily by simply adopting a revised way of documenting acceptance criteria in a very English-like manner. And in committing and doing it this way, you've already facilitated an example-driven, solution-based thought process throughout the team. One of the biggest tenets for BDD is to foster early collaboration. And by adhering to a structured facilitation and documentation process, the intent is to resolve ambiguity upfront and enabling business and technical folks to be on the same page. And lastly, with increasing interest in the industry, there are a bunch of APIs such as JBehave and Cucumber in the Java realm and RSpec for Ruby that streamline the auto-generation of tests, converting BDD specifications into executable test specifications like we've demonstrated. And hopefully with that, we've provided you with a taste of streamlining one of CI/CD's biggest bottlenecks, truly adopting a test and quality-driven mindset, shifting QA significantly left by implementing it at the start of a development effort and not after the fact. And now back to you, Mason.
Well, thank you very much, Rajat. I want to say that the technical demonstration really showed the intuitive nature of the BDD language, so that was really neat to see. So with a couple minutes left, we'll go to a couple questions real quick. One of the first questions that we have are you saying that to implement BDD, we only need to revise the format of writing acceptance criteria?
So essentially, yes. But in committing to expressing your acceptance criteria in this revised context, action, outcome format, you are sort of building a way to facilitate example-driven discussions that eventually manifest into system behaviors, which are your acceptance criteria. And all of this is aimed at resolving ambiguity right up front in the collaboration and development process. So here's what I would recommend doing. Try taking a set of acceptance criteria that you currently have in your organization and attempt to revise the format into Gherkin. And then with your team, sort of compare the before and after, compare that bulleted acceptance criteria list against the Gherkin syntax acceptance criteria. I'll almost guarantee that the latter will be less ambiguous and be better received when it comes to downstream processes like development and testing.
Gotcha. I know we've run over a couple minutes, but if you do have any questions you'd like to submit, please feel free. If we can't answer it now, we'll definitely respond after. We will take one more, and this is a good one. This actually asks if BDD can be implemented outside of the non-agile SDLC world.
Good question. So assuming non-agile, once again, sort of refers to waterfall, where sort of your specifications are written up front, and often those long, verbose Word documents. Ultimately, it all depends on how you decompose your specifications. If you can organize a long specification into, say, a bulleted list, and then add some context around each of those bullets, and then go ahead and, as a part of the next step, document those bullets with the context in a Gherkin format, then you've sort of taken a step towards implementing BDD. And while doing so, what you can do is ask your testers, what they're doing with these specs as they're being written. If they're writing accompanying test cases, which I fully imagine they are, they can then apply the same effort in creating these quote-unquote feature files. Remember the feature files from our demonstration? In their BDD automation framework, such that they've taken the first step towards testing and automating before even perhaps a single line of code is written. And that sort of ties back to our discussion about test-driven development. So to summarize, yes, we can definitely apply BDD practices regardless of whether you're following Agile or Waterfall or any other non-conventional SDLC as well.
Right. All right, well, we've run out of time this afternoon, but like I mentioned, if you have any additional questions that we did not address, please feel free to email me directly at the email address on the slide, and I will ensure that our team responds to your questions. Thank you very much, Rajat. Thank you all for joining us, and we will email you the link to the webinar video once it's live on our website later this week. Everyone have a great day. Thank you very much.